I'm Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 93 of the Wheatley podcast. As always, thank you very much for tuning in, whether it's on YouTube or any of the podcast platforms. I want to say thank you very much to Brendan for coming on last week to talk about, what it was like when he was a surgeon with regards to mental health, but also sand play therapy, which is his profession now. Something I didn't know a lot about, but we talked about Carl Jung, and we talked about how sand play therapy was developed and the symbolism in it and the conscious and unconscious mind. And I learned an awful lot, and I was out of my depth on many occasions, and Brendan dragged me back in. So it was very good of him to do that. But subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. And as always, thanks for your support throughout the week with all our podcast, all our social media stuff and that. So let's get into our episode this week. I'd like to introduce our guest, who is a street artist for quite a number of years now, and his name is Asbestos. How are you doing, Asbestos?
Very good, thank you.
I think we always start with a short history of Upbringing. I'm going to start slightly different this week. The people watching us on YouTube will see that your face is not visible. Why is that?
The main thing is really playing with anonymity. So for me, anonymity creates a freedom in my work. So when you're a person, when you kind of express yourself through your art, your personality comes out in that. But what I'm trying to do with my art at the moment is play with different versions of personality. So the idea of the masks comes from various different things, but one of them is kind of a conversation I had with an artist friend years ago where I was already doing mask stuff, and he mentioned, did I know that the word persona is actually the Greek for mask?
Okay.
And if you think of Greek theatre, the actors would have played multiple roles. So within the space of a play, they might play 3 or 4 roles. So as they leave the stage and come back on, they're putting on another mask or another persona. So if you think about kind of what we do in everyday life, like the persona that you have for your podcast is different to the one you have with your friends, with your family and work, and in all those different environments. So for me, playing with the idea of identity and playing with the idea of masks is just a really easy way to create multiple characters and multiple personas. So even though it's me within the masks in a lot of the work that I do, it's me playing a role, so playing a character. So I don't really see myself as myself completely. I can see myself as a version or playing a character within that role.
I actually had the next question, and I suppose you kind of answered it there in a way, but it's the idea of just as, if I think about myself and what I'm like in a conversation with a group of people and what it might be like in a conversation with one person, it does change, like the way you speak. You sometimes are, whether it goes into the kind of realm of politics or social issues or whatever it might be, you might hold your tongue a bit more. And I was wondering, was that the case with your artwork when it came to the mask? Did it allow you to express yourself with a little bit more freedom?
I think it always does. And I think I don't know where I read it, but there was a story about how people who have alter egos are able to kind of separate themselves or express themselves better. So there's Beyonce has an alter ego for when she goes on stage, and various creatives or various acts or various performers have that, and the ability to be able to express yourself within those roles. Like if you think of actors, they always relish playing the bad character. It's something that they're not allowed to do in real life. So exploring all of those avenues is really exciting, and being able to explore different characters. It's not even different characters, but different identities or different stories. And instead of me being presented as me, as the everyday me that people meet day to day, I can present a very pure and simple version of what I'm trying to get across in my paintings.
Right. So let's go back then. So could you give us a brief history of your upbringing, please?
Well, I suppose, as you said, this kind of interview is quite different in that I'm presenting kind of a character, and the character that I present as Asbestos is somebody who's an artist who's worked on the street, but kind of an artistic background to that. I was always interested in art never went to our college, but even in school, there was like a Spanish student who was really into graffiti. But there was always something that jarred with me with graph that I would have done it a little bit as a kid, but it never really fixed with me that it was what I wanted to do, because writing your name over and over again was was fun, but it just felt as if there was something missing. But yeah, I think I probably had a relatively normal Irish upbringing, suburban upbringing. I think it was probably jumping around a few schools, but I think one of the things has kind of led to, I think, my strength in creativity and strength is was probably at times a bit of a loner. So being comfortable with yourself, or being comfortable in your own company, I think is something that a lot of people have had to confront over the last 2 years. So that in and of itself is really interesting. And I think one of the things that always fascinates me is the people you meet in school who are maybe not the most vocal, or the kind of the people in school who are the kind of the most popular ones are the ones maybe who are least successful in life at times.
Yeah.
It's the ones that actually have different types of interests. And I think one of the things that's really important for people, even for their mental health, like one of the things growing up was I was always into lots and lots of different things. I was always fascinated by whether it was learning things or crafts or just getting stuck into things. And I was always curious, and that curiosity is kind of essential for as an artist.
Because you mentioned mental health there, and I think that comes into focus quite a lot when we're teenagers, or maybe when we're coming into our 20s. When did you first become aware of mental health?
Probably, I suppose, in college, but I'm not sure if it was necessarily something that was spoken about properly. I think realistically, mental health has only really been talked about properly in the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think the acceptance of mental health being something that we can talk about is relatively new and relatively odd. Like the idea of, like, you think about therapists and you always think about that in the context of TV shows from America.
Yeah.
It was something that was alien to us. And talking about our feelings, like the Irish male is well known for being brilliant at talking about their feelings. So,
yeah, they have. Yeah.
I read a great message somebody had written last week, which was saying that golf is effectively a way for men to ask other men out for a walk when they're too embarrassed to do so.
Yeah,
I think it's so true. Like we as men in Ireland are terrible about talking about how we're feeling or about how our mental health is. I think that's something that, as you ask a question like talking about mental health or knowing about mental health, I think I've only really kind of embraced talking about it in the last few years, really, in the way that we should all probably be doing it. And I don't think I'm that strange in doing that. It feels like friends and kind of society in general is learning quite quickly and learning on the fly about being able to talk about mental health.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of our answers that have come from this question over the 92 episodes that have come before have been very similar, where it's become, obviously it depends on the age group or the age of the person we're talking to, but it does change quite significantly with regards to someone my age, and then maybe someone who's 20 years of age who have heard of mental health, since they were 10 or 11. It's become a kind of, whether it's in the house or at school, whatever it might be. And it's always interesting to kind of get answers from different age groups on that kind of thing. So obviously, I want to ask you where the name came from.
Yeah, a lot of people ask me that. It comes from the fact, as an artist working in the street, the reaction to work. So asbestos is benign when it's not known about. So when it's in the ground or when it's in buildings, it's not harmful, or it's not noticed. But when it does get exposed, or when you're aware of it, it's quite, in parts, quite an important reaction. And for me, that's what I want my art to do, which is to have a reaction from people that is not necessarily shocking, but that provokes an emotion.
Yeah, and obviously we hear so many all the negativity about it. So it obviously is quite a shocking name when you hear it for the first time. But when So when, with regards to street art or graffiti, when did you initially get into that?
Oh God, probably when I was 17 or 18.
Okay.
So many years ago. And it was probably like most people who've ever got into it, especially kind of my generation or the next generation, through a book called Subway Art that was by two photographers in New York who photographed all of the early trains, and that was just the only way you found out about graffiti, really, like until kind of the mid 2000s. The internet wasn't really, or the early 2000s, the internet wasn't really a resource. So finding out about art and street art and graffiti was incredibly difficult. So that initial book was a spark of realizing, wow, there's this amazing world out there that's so expressive and lacking exploitation commercially. Now it obviously has now, but back in the early days it was very free and expressive.
Do you see it as more of more appreciated now, as you know, you have the older, maybe the older generation who see it as a terrible thing, you know, like as if, you know, you're making a mess of the streets or whatever. But then you have people of maybe our generation or people younger than us who see it as more as a beautiful thing.
It depends though, because I think the people who see it as a beautiful thing are probably looking at murals or street art, whereas they're probably not looking at people bombing trains or tagging or doing prose or doing what is effectively the source of graffiti, is tagging. For me, it's the voice of a disaffected generation. It's the voice of people who have no other way of expressing themselves. And yes, people don't like it, but it's only paint.
Yeah.
If you think about kind of the protests that are going on at the moment, like over the cobblestone, over development of the city, you knock something down, it can't be rebuilt.
Yeah.
Whereas you can always paint over something, you can always clean the paint off. It's not the biggest deal in the world. And I think the level of ire or kind of worry about it is kind of misplaced, because a city without graffiti, a city without art on the street is a dead city.
Yeah, and you were at the protest yesterday, were you?
Briefly, yeah.
Okay, and how was the kind of atmosphere down there?
Well, I suppose it was very positive from a celebratory point of view, but then also seemed quite depressed. And will this make any difference? The people with money who are developing these things have a lot of power and a lot of influence. So a little pub playing trad music is not important, but it is to a lot of people. So hopefully things start to change and the fabric and the culture of the city can be preserved.
Absolutely, and we're going to get a bit more into that a little bit later on, with how your art and you know, social issues kind of roll together. So I want to talk a bit first though about the Lost series. It's something that you've been doing for a number of years now. When and why did it start?
It started with a poster I saw in Stag's Head of somebody who'd lost their Harley Davidson jumper, and I just thought there was such love and attention put into making this poster, but it was something that was kind of important to them, but not necessarily important in life.
Yeah.
And so I started making posters with things that you wouldn't necessarily want back if you lost them. And it was more or less a commentary on our obsession with objects to define us. So we define ourselves with the clothes that we wear, with the art that we buy, with the house that we live in, with the furniture, the friends, how we portray ourselves. We define our place in the world by the things and the objects we have around us, but they also kind of consume us and can affect us. So it was fun. It's fun playing with that. But for me, the really interesting part isn't so much putting up the poster or doing the art itself. It's the interaction I have with people. So the contact that people have, whether they're just confused or really getting into it, and play with character with it. People have sent me ransom notes. People have tried to get extracted money out of me. People have sent me things. So it's a lot of fun in that way, because people get a real kick out of something. But also, in general, they're mostly small posters, small stickers, and people don't notice them most of the time. But as soon as they notice one, they notice many, and
Yeah.
they just get a kick out of finding them.
I love them. I've been going through as many as possible, and if you'd allow me just to name my top three of the ones that are up. So the crane, as probably a lot of people, as you Google these things, the crane is the one that seems to pop up. Maybe because it has a very significant message in it, really.
Yeah, I think so. And I kind of within the law series, I stayed away from talking about social issues. I was trying to do something more about the person themselves and the leaving those things open to people to interpret. But that one just felt as if it needed to be said.
Yeah. Yeah, people need to go check these out online, by the way. If they're not in Dublin, go and check them. But the eye test one, I think this is more personal to me because I've worn glasses since I was 7 or 8 years of age, and the use obviously of the eye test is very clever. And the third one is maybe more to do with my maybe my age and my the mixtape, because the mixtape, I'm not ashamed to say I've sent mixtapes to people, and I've given mixtapes to people back when I was 13 or 14 years of age. Why did you pick a mixtape as a good idea for that?
It was just a fun idea because it was something that is probably something we have in the back of the wardrobe but have forgotten about, but has an emotional significance. So it's worthless, but probably could even be the most valuable thing you own.
Yeah, it's certainly one of those things that you put so much love into when you're putting it together, and they're gone now, unfortunately. I mean, obviously, people can still do it with CDs and stuff like that, but it's not the same. Let me just read a quick advert out, and we'll get back to it. All right. So, Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. Okay, so there's something really fascinating in the way you use the eye in your works. So it got me kind of thinking, because in some of the bigger murals, the eyes are very striking amidst what's going on around them. But then I was thinking about searching then and looking, and the last series kind of can come into that as well, because if you were to take a lost crane as a lost crane, you would go searching and looking for it. And it just made me think of the eye as something that seems really, really important in your work. Am I overthinking it a bit?
No, not necessarily. The reason they're important is they act as a focal point of engagement. So getting that right and getting the emotion and the attitude right within that can dictate an awful lot of the kind of the final outcome of how the mural feels or what message I'm trying to get across. Usually, like even with the one in Cork, it was very much about kind of fear and hesitation and worry. And there was just that sense of how to express that. So the point is of the eye is the clearest part of it. And then the rest of it I can go as detailed or as abstract as I want, but I always kind of paint the eye as realistic as possible.
Yeah, it's funny because when you listen to artists or see documentary about artists, they might mention that the eye is the hardest part to paint or draw. It's just they're so striking in your work that they're right. They're the main part of the piece, and I just think it's very interesting that they go on that route to comparing to other people talking about how the eye is the hardest part. I always found in art that the hands were the hardest part to draw, but I'm not. Yeah, I'm not an artist. I think a lot of it is hard to draw. But so I guess when you're talking about the murals, where does that initial process start? Because for something so large, where does it begin?
Well, it always starts with the idea, depending on whether it's a commission piece or part of a festival or for whatever reason the space is being opened up. And then I usually try and think whether it's something that's site specific or whether there's a message that I want to get across. So the one on O'Connell Street was very much in conjunction with Hugh Lane, but also it was very much about COVID, but in a very optimistic way about memory of people as opposed to mourning them. And the one in Cork, it was a difficult one to kind of choose what I wanted to do, but there was in the back of my head this desire to talk about the kind of crisis we're having at the moment, but very much so in the context of thinking about it in a slightly more not necessarily abstract way, but more personal way. And I think having a little bit of ambiguity there was quite interesting. So starting off with that, the space was given to me by Ardu as part of the festival. It was looking at the wall, thinking about what I could do, thinking about how the city interacted with it, because there's no point in putting something up into a space where it doesn't feel as if it integrates. So I very much worked with the wall and with how I was going to paint it, and then the surface was quite difficult to paint on, so I was going to simplify things as much as possible to play with the amount of detail. And then kind of conceptually, it was looking around and having been to Cork a few times and traveling there a good bit over the last few years, seeing that it was no different from other places around Ireland and around the world where we're suffering from this housing crisis. So that mask was based on that, and I think it worked really well. And then from the point of view of actually making it, just a matter of scaling things up. It's a process like everything else. It's kind of just a process of kind of building a grid and mapping it out and then painting it. It just takes a lot longer.
Yeah. When you're working then at the wall, are you wearing a mask? And I mean, maybe more than a COVID mask, I guess.
It depends.
Yeah.
Generally not. I usually just work as I am, but a lot of the time I'm kind of quite far up on the wall away from people. But the idea of the masks in my work are about anonymity, but more about anonymity, not as an absolute. It's just it's another tool to work with, as opposed to worrying about kind of the sense of identity of an artist.
Yeah, I get it. It's funny with the fact that we're recording today on Halloween as well, so it's kind of fitting in another way too. Maybe I should have worn one as well, actually. But who inspires you as an artist?
God, so many people from every walk of life. Like I would kind of delve into things that would be like probably the biggest inspiration recently has been an artist called Joseph Beuys, who's a German artist from kind of the 1960s, and his work is incredibly inspirational. It kind of links back in a very visceral way to my own history. Like, he was in Dublin just after I was born, and one of the stories that I kind of build around my art is this idea of kind of an alter ego, even an alter ego within Asbestos. And that comes from the Dublin Monaghan bombings, where my mum actually walked past one of the car bombs just before it went off.
Wow.
About 5 minutes before. So I would have been killed. So I kind of create this fictional narrative about, if I had been, who would that entity be? So like the entity that didn't exist. There's another version of me that didn't exist in another thread of history. And that character called Left Hand is effectively a naive version who looks at the world in a very simplistic way through my eyes. So that's kind of the face you see here of the circle and the cross and the jagged mouth is the face of Left Hand. So it's two different versions of me looking at the world.
Okay. I'm fascinated by that, actually, by, separate personas and artists. And I've talked to people before on here about those kind of things, and musicians use it an awful lot, and I guess we get to see it a bit more. But like, there's so many in art in general, whether it's music, but it's Banksy obviously being a huge one. But it just fascinates me to find out why people choose it. But that's about your mom by the car bomb is
I think though that when you think about artists and performers, that's a very exaggerated version of that.
Okay.
we all do it. Absolutely every single one of it does it. So the version of yourself that you have that's looking out at the world is a different version to the version of yourself that people perceive.
Yeah.
So we perceive ourselves being projected in one way. So the person that is me in everyday life, I think of it as being an entity, but nobody else in the world sees that other than me.
Yeah.
And when I'm in work, I have a certain persona. When I'm in with my friends, when I'm with my family, when I'm with different siblings, different types of friends, when I'm doing this type of thing, every single instance, when I'm out at night, when I'm having a meal, when I've had a few drinks, different personas come out from different people. So the versions that I'm creating are very exaggerated.
Yeah.
Every single person has multiple different personas. And I think by accepting that and understanding that, you start to realize what's the persona or the version of yourself that you like the most, and what's the person you can actually appreciate the most.
I only really started to see that when I started this podcast, which was about a year and a half ago now. And when I see myself on the podcast talking to people who mostly I haven't met before, but when I go into the gym, say doing jiu-jitsu or whatever it is, I'm more mouthy and I curse a bit and all that kind of stuff. And when I'm here doing the podcast, I'm very polite and very mannerly. And you're right though, but it changes with every situation. It's not just either or. There's many of them,
Yeah, I was speaking to my cousin, who's her partner is a absolutely lovely, quiet, chatty guy. But she was saying that the only time he ever loses his temper is when he's in a car. And like we all have those moments of rage when we're in a car. And it's amazing how we can suddenly become this astonishingly angry person. But then we get out of the car and we probably chat to the person and be as happy as Larry with that same person that we were shouting at. So
it's
that's
true.
Kind of I don't think we think about our different personas as much as we should. And I think there's almost a sense of shame of thinking about yourself as being more than one person.
I get it. Yeah.
Huge joy of that.
Do you, when you're working from at home on ideas and that, do you work to music or anything? What way do you work?
It depends in two parts. Like there's one part of my work that's production, and there's one part that's conception. So thinking of ideas I always have ideas in my head, and whether I'm out walking, listening to music, or without music, whether I'm in work, whether I'm driving, I'll just take notes. I'll write something down. I'll put it in a notebook, or I'll write into my phone, and that part of it, I suppose, can happen anywhere and can be inspired anywhere. I think for me, the thing that kind of brings the most inspiration is just learning and reading and exploring and researching. And the more that you do of that, the more ideas kind of spark out of that.
Mm.
And when it comes to production, when it comes to actually making stuff, I'd probably listen to music an awful lot more in that part of it.
Yeah.
That's more that's a different part of your brain that's kind of almost meditative. Because you're doing something probably quite monotonous, and you get lost in that. And actually, funny enough, you often come up with a lot of ideas in that instance as well, but in a kind of in a roundabout way.
Yeah, I was, when I used to kind of mess around with short stories and stuff, I used to always listen to music, and I found that if I listened to something that was too lyrical, I started to absorb the lyrics and the content, and then when I read back on the story, I'd see some influences. Whether, if you listen to something like Bob Dylan or someone who's very wordy, it would start to kind of creep in, and I'd have to kind of peel it back to something that was much more basic lyrically, or maybe even to something classical or something, that it's not encroaching on your work.
No, completely. Yeah. I think inspiration from other people is great. The trick is not to be copying, and to actually have your own spin on it. But like essentially there are very few new ideas. There's just us applying our lens of the world onto probably ideas that have been around for thousands of years.
Yeah. I would tend to agree with that, especially with my short stories. So I want to ask you about, you mentioned the mural down in Cork, and it really, if people haven't seen it, go and look it up on Google, or go to Asbestos's page on Instagram. There's obviously photos from different angles. there's one in particular that was kind of from a further away. You know, there's the one that you'll see obviously as soon as you Google it up close. And I guess the further away you are from it, it seemed to be more powerful, just in, you know, whether it was in distance, just because of the color of the buildings around or whatever it might be. But really, the idea of if you wouldn't mind describing what it looks like first, if you don't mind.
Well, it's me wearing a striped blue and white top, sitting with my head down, with a box on my head in the shape of a house. It's kind of very simple. It's like a Monopoly figure, a house, and with this similar face drawn on, but with a sad face and tilted down, and one of the eyes is looking out across the city. The idea behind it is, as I said before, is about what is home. And one of the things I like to do in my work is have a little bit of a sense of ambiguity there, so that each person who's seeing it can kind of bring their lens or their filter to the world in it. So for some people, what is home is an amazing place, is a wonderful place, is a welcoming community. For other people, it's a place of fear, especially over COVID. People have been in abusive relationships and been stuck at home, and home to them is a place that induces terror and fear. It's also now with the housing crisis, home is somewhere that we can't afford, that our previous generations could have for a lot less of their income, and now we're worried about, are we going to be kicked out of our homes? Can we afford them? So the question is so open that I think it opens up a discussion about actually what home is. And I didn't want it to be about Cork specifically, even though Cork is experiencing the same things. It's actually, I've been getting messages from people, even somebody I know in New York was saying how it's no different there than it is anywhere else, in the sense of living in a small apartment, not knowing when, if you can pay your rent, and that fear of being potentially being homeless. Like the homeless crisis has been overlooked in the last couple of years because of the pandemic, and it was probably the most talked about news story for a long time pre-pandemic, because it was so severe in Ireland. So I like that sense with the mural of the figure representing a simple concept, but one that people can talk about and can provoke a conversation.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask you about working on a piece like that, because it is about a definitive thing that's quite, you know, important in Ireland at the moment. And like you said, in many places, I actually just finished reading a novel by Willie Lawton, and he actually talks about he wrote the novel because he couldn't buy a house for years. I think until he was in his 30s, or maybe late 30s, early 40s. And his character was based on someone who had to scrimp and save and do everything possible, even maybe going outside of the law at times, to get what they just to get a down payment for a house. Obviously, that's in the States, but it's a worldwide thing. Is it something that you've been particularly drawn to? For, you know, did you read up about it before? Was it something that you were always keen on learning about? Because I think when it comes to news programs, sometimes we want to switch off because these things are quite hard hitting and kind of, I suppose, depressing in a way.
I think it's unavoidable. It's not so much that I've been reading up about it specifically, but it's a conversation that just doesn't go away at the moment in Ireland, and everyone talks about it in every level of society, whether it's people in their 20s or 30s, whether it's parents, whether it's family members. That sense of panic and fear around that is palpable. So from that point of view, it was almost, there was no research to do. It was such a kind of shocking and omnipresent problem that I think the sense of fear and foreboding that people have at the moment with housing, with the effects of Brexit, with the climate crisis, and for young people, that sense of impending doom and that sense of fear is just permeating every part of their life. And the need to escape, or the need to have an escape mentally, is so important. And that need to be able to have a safe space, whether that's a home or whether that's whatever space it is, I think what is really interesting, like even around your first question around kind of understanding mental health. mental health is feeling happy in yourself, and that fear that people have, that kind of overarching kind of sense of dread that people are going through at the moment is terrifying for a lot of people.
That's it's one thing hearing about it on the news and hearing about it from, politicians and campaigners, but it's another thing for it to kind of, I suppose, permeate the art scene. And I think of it in the way that obviously mental health is something that's very important to me. But when I hear someone, and I use Brezzy as an example because he's someone who's been very, very vocal on mental health, probably one of the first people who spoke about it honestly on RT television, and you got to hear from someone at the time who was in his 20s and was just putting it all out there. Obviously, he wrote a book about it, but there's been many people since, and I think artists, when they get involved, they do tend to drag the younger people along with them, just naturally, because that's the kind of the format that younger people will listen to rather than listening to politicians. So it's so important for yourself and for everybody else talking about social issues to kind of speak up about it. And I think that runs quite through your work a lot, social issues.
Yeah, it can do. I'm not somebody who's going out as a campaigner artist, but it would be naive of me to think that these things don't exist.
Mm.
So the social issues that I do touch on are very much the ones that are permeating within my own social sphere or within my own world, and the ones that I feel most connected to. I think it's interesting you're talking about kind of that expression of talking about mental health. And I think one of the things that's interesting around with creativity and artists is I think they're equipped quite well to think about ideas and to maybe express themselves better. That doesn't necessarily mean their mental health is better, but the ability for us to talk about it is so important. And I think, as you mentioned, somebody like Brezzy, being from kind of a community or a space in which him and his peers would never talk about it. And there was a sense of bravado and a sense of masculinity that talking about it was seen as a weakness. Like, quite the opposite. Talking about it is probably the bravest thing you could possibly do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need those figures in society who can talk about the fact that, sometimes you just feel like shit. Sometimes you don't feel like yourself. Sometimes you just want to curl up, and we've all experienced that. I've experienced it, but I think one of the things that has been the most liberating is actually talking about things, talking about problems, and whether that's just publicly or with or privately, it's a massive cathartic process. Like even my uncle passed away from COVID, and I think it was one of the kind of the inspirations for doing the mural on O'Connell Street. But what was really interesting was all the conversations I had with people who had lost somebody or who were kind of affected by it, and how talking about it is so cathartic. And I think one of the things that we are actually pretty good at in Ireland is talking about death. I think we've kind of got a little bit of an irreverence to death in Ireland. Like the act of waking somebody's death is quite a positive thing, because it's talking about all the positives that have happened in their life. And if you look at like any funeral that I've been to over the last 5 or 10 years, has always been talking about how that person had a positive effect within the world. And they've usually been very uplifting and very, very sad occasions, but sad in the context of sad because an amazing person is gone, not sad because of that momentary lack of life, the point of death for whatever reason. So I think we're, funnily enough, even though we don't necessarily talk about our emotions that well in Ireland, I think we're actually pretty good at talking about death and trying to find a way of dealing with that.
Yeah, and it's funny when you put those two things together, and the fact that we will talk about death a lot easier than we talk about mental health. And I agree as well that when we're out talking to someone, it is a very brave thing to do. And it's not only, brave for yourself, but I think the idea that all this normalizing of something that is very normal in the first place. But all that normalizing of it allows the younger people to kind of talk about it then, because my generation, I suppose, back in schools and all that, it wasn't a thing. We mentioned this earlier on in the podcast. Like, it wasn't a thing where we all, talked about it. It was very much brushed under the carpet, and all you'd hear about it was the person had gone into a hospital, or the crazy person in the house at the end of the road, or whatever. It was always just this kind of thing that was pushed aside. Now that it's being spoken about a bit more, it can only be positive. But I think there has to be it's good that people like Brezzy and people in higher positions, I guess, are speaking about it more, because it gives the younger people, I suppose, a little bit more hope and a little bit more of a chance to, we have such a problem with people taking their own lives in Ireland, young men taking their own lives, obviously young women as well. But we need to kind of promote the fact that all of the talking is a positive thing for people, and it's not anything to do with weakness or anything like that.
Yeah, and probably the scariest thing to talk about is your own mental health, and having the bravery to do that is actually far braver than any of the things that are associated with toxic masculinity and masculinity in a negative way. Like, I think as a man growing up in Ireland, the way that worth was evaluated was through sport, was through getting into college, was being strong, was doing all of these things that were very, very simple binary masculine tropes. And I think, to me, the most difficult and challenging things in life have always been probably the things that you're scared about the most, as opposed to the things that you're trying to do that are bravado. And I think having the ability to be brave to do that will be inspiring. Like, I think the generation that's coming up are far braver talking about mental health, about sexuality, about the fears that they're going through. They're probably far better at protecting each other and better at kind of understanding each other. Like, if you look at kids in school, whether it's somebody is different because of their sexuality, if they have ADHD, if they have so many different things. And I think I remember talking to somebody who's a teacher and saying, there's barely a child in the class that doesn't have something that makes them different. And those different things were things we probably looked down on or were embarrassed about. But now people they know it's part of who they are. Like, the things that are perceived as negative are actually influencing who we are as a person and make us stronger or make us the unique people that we are. So the things that are kind of that I fear, that I don't want to talk about, are the things that probably have formed me as a person, are actually real positives. Like, so as much as I might think they're weaknesses, they probably made me a better person.
Yeah, we actually spoke a lot about that in the last podcast as well. It's a coincidence that you mentioned it, that idea of, weaknesses not being defined in the wrong way. Does creating help your mental health?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think there's, as I said, there's two parts to creating. There's the physical, actual, the manufacture, the making of, and I think that's quite a meditative process. But to actually get to a point to which you're happy with the work that you're creating, you really need to challenge yourself, and you really need to kind of stretch the idea that you're pushing, and you need to make sure I'm almost having arguments with myself and kind of rewriting. Like, even the weekend before Cork, I knew what I was painting and I knew what I was doing, but I had it in my head that I knew exactly what it was, but I couldn't express it properly. And it was only on the Sunday morning before I went down to Cork that I went out for a long walk in the forest, and then when I came back, I was sitting on a bench just thinking about it, and it started to form clearly how the exact idea. And I think creativity, to me, is a really strong way of trying to understand maybe some of the contradictions that are within my own personality, or the contradictions within what I'm trying to do. And I think one word that I've been really interested in exploring over the last kind of few months is the word hypocrite. And I think we see it as basically a word that we spit out saying that person's a hypocrite. But I challenge anyone not to find hypocrisy within their own lives. Like we will spend immense amount of effort separating all of our recycling, but then we'll jump on a plane and go to America.
Yeah.
And I'll do that as well as everyone else. We'll justify buying a car because we actually want a nice car, but we won't do something else. So our hypocrisies are not necessarily hypocrisies per se. They're these contradictions that we have, that we justify things within our own lives and within our own daily life to make ourselves happy. And there are consequences within my life to the decisions that I make, but I'll often make hypocritical decisions that I'll look at back and go, actually, you know what? I was probably talking shite there, but I was talking shite because I wanted to do that. I wanted to go to that restaurant, or I wanted to go on that trip, or I wanted to do that thing. But it was probably me being quite hypocritical. And I think embracing that, not necessarily embracing that word, because I don't think it's a word that I want to embrace, but being aware of our own hypocrisies is actually a good way of us trying to understand other people.
Yeah.
Because I probably, as a person, maybe I look back at my opinions and maybe they're a little bit too entrenched, and maybe should be more open-minded to other people's opinions. And I think my hypocrisies come out within that by thinking that my opinion on the world is the right opinion, and it's only one of billions of opinions around the world. Which is right is within a certain sphere is very difficult to say, but the act of listening and the act of listening to other people is quite fascinating. And to me, that's what has really kind of shone out within the world of creativity, and how creativity helps me to almost break down that sense of hypocrisy, or that sense of trying to get to what my real self, or my own kind of core beliefs and value system is.
Do you enjoy the interview process?
That's an interesting question. I think I do, because generally I end up probably talking shite and then realizing, you know what, actually, this is 50% is shite. Just say 50% is actually it maybe clarifies the thoughts in your head when you have to speak and be honest about your own opinions. I suppose the question is, why do you ask that, or is that a question you ask everyone?
No, this is the first time I've ever asked anyone this question.
Yeah, I think people are fearful of interviews, and I think over the years I've done lots of them in different guises, or done talks and different presentations and things over a long time. And I think I do quite enjoy them because it challenges me to not let my ego become too overpowering. And I have to, when you're actually out there saying something to other people in this context, I think you have to be self-aware and kind of try and be honest, as honest as you can be. And I think that honesty is quite liberating. Even though I'm sitting here with the box in my head, I can see the hypocrisy here. Don't worry.
Well, you did mention it, so it's fair enough. But it's been very speaking about the box, because it's interesting for me to talk to you, to talk to someone with a box in the head, because for one, the facial, the cues aren't there for me, and I'm so worried about, not just today, but I mean in general, about when I'm talking to people about jumping in before they're finished their thought. And it's been very interesting that way, that there's no vocal cues. But at the same time, and I suppose the reason I asked the question, because it's there's a good flow to your answers, and you know when to start and when to stop. And I just it's been really an interesting interview for me, because of the fact that it's been so different in just the sense that I can't see it. I've done one where it's been over Zoom, but the person's camera wasn't working, so we did it that way. And I struggled a bit with it because it was just the voice, but at least there's something there with you, even if I'm able to see my own reflection back and things like that. It's a different.
This mask specifically comes from a performance in the Hugh Lane Percussion Night.
Oh.
And the idea behind it was I created 3 blackboards based on that artist that I spoke about before, Joseph Boyce. He created these blackboards when he did his talk in Dublin. And I wanted to take a nod to that. But the idea behind the piece was called Erase My Memories, and it's about the act of destroying art and destroying what I've created, or destroying memories. Based on my mom is suffering from Alzheimer's. So it's about the Alzheimer's that she has and the memories that I'm seeing fading. So I created 3 blackboards with 3 different images associated with her. One was as I mentioned, the car bomb. Another one was me as a kid with her, and then a close up of her eye. So there's 3 different blackboards, all drawn in chalk. And then for 3 hours, people could come into the gallery with a duster and a piece of chalk and could destroy the work.
Right.
So they could effectively, I'd watch these memories fade and erase and be distorted in front of me. But by wearing the mask with the mirror, the idea of having a mirrored mask was that I was trying to remove myself, even though I was present and cognizant of what was happening. I was trying to actually get everyone to look almost into themselves as they were doing this. So while I was creating a character that was in the room but was almost not in the room, and I think that created a tension and an interesting dialogue. As you said, if I was there and I was without the mask, people would be looking at my facial expression, whereas 95% of people came in, had one look at me, and then just proceeded on. They almost ignored me. I was just this entity as opposed to a specific person. Like the face is so expressive that we invest so much time in it. So it was both liberating and funny and emotional and tearful, but it was vastly rewarding. And I think that sense that we only do it once a year in Ireland by putting on a mask, but the ability to actually play other characters and play a version of yourself is something that I think that maybe there's a role in society to do that more often, because to be able to throw yourself into kind of an abandon and play another role is so liberating to you. I think that's one thing that dance is actually so important about, like especially like dancing to rhythmic music. Like when you're in a club and you're in your own world and you have your eyes closed, you're almost in a safe state of trance. And I think that's why people like going out at night. That's why people like socializing in that way, is that it is an escape, that they can actually almost be at one with themselves, even though they're around loads of people.
I go back to jiu-jitsu a lot when people bring up, those kind of ideas. Like when I go in there, so I have a lot of anxiety. So when I go in there, it's immediately gone, because all we have now is me and my training partner, and we're both trying to choke each other. It's taken away, it's and I suppose maybe the person would have to experience it to, obviously to totally understand it. But there's a mindfulness in it, because it's completely zoned into protecting your neck or your arms or your legs, whatever they're going to try and go for. And that's why it's so important to me, because it rids me of that anxiety, of everyday anxiety. The little and the big things that I worry about all the time is gone in jiu-jitsu. And I know what you mean about dancing as well. Like you see so much abandon when it comes to people dancing in clubs, and it's so freeing. And sometimes you're standing at the edge of the dance floor going, why can't I do that? I don't let myself get into that space. That's my own problem. I understand that, but I'm not the only one. We all stand on the edge of the dance floor hoping that we could someday do what that person on the dance floor is doing, but we don't allow ourselves to do it.
I think that's kind of why, in some ways, dance music is so much easier to dance to, because you can just stand there and you don't have to be a good dancer to dance music. You just have to throw your arms around with abandon. And I think that's why people like that. But I think it's fascinating, just even saying about what you're saying that about jiu-jitsu and about sport. Like for me, sport, I'm probably an armchair fan to a small extent. But what's wonderful about sport is that ability for men to actually have a safe space that they can be in, and can hopefully express themselves. Now, sport has never been that great a space for men to do that, but I think it's becoming better within sports clubs where men are actually probably talking about their mental health more, and that ability to have an escape is a massive advantage. That ability to, as you say, go on a pitch or go to a gym and just lose yourself into a world of calm. It's almost meditative.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that the gym I go to is like that. It's very welcoming with us all, and obviously I've had a few people on from the gym talk about their mental health on this podcast, and it's such a I think it says a lot about the gym in itself, the coach, the owner, and everybody in there to just allow that safe space to in there where we're at. Like, it's a sport that we are trying to kill each other, but it's not. It's a nice way to kill you, but I guess. But so what about in your spare time? What do you like to do then?
Well, I suppose between work and everything else, like my spare time is usually is mostly consumed with my art. I suppose I try and read, try and invest in friendships, try and invest in time with other people. Yeah, I suppose my art is probably the main thing that I do other than my day job. And but I think I've, over the last like 5 or 10 years, have probably invested an awful lot more time into actually being better to myself and looking after myself. Like, I think one thing, like even several years ago, went through an awful lot of stress with for various different reasons. And I remember a relation of mine who had kind of some business failures and had been kind of down in the doldrums, just saying, you can't affect a lot of things, and there are things that you're going to worry about. And when something terrible goes wrong, you suddenly realize the things you were worried about last week are inconsequential. And when we're pushed into a situation, so when I was in that kind of situation where I didn't see any hope, or was suffering kind of severely of stress, I could only see the result of the things that were making me worried. But I think one of the things he had said was, like, stress is a useless emotion. And I think it's always struck with me. It's like I've learned to actually deal with stress quite well, in that there's nothing if there's nothing I can do about it, then I try not to get stressed about it. And in general, I don't. I get stressed an awful lot less, because I just realize it's out of my control. And when it's out of my control, just getting stressed is actually making it worse for me. And it sounds so simple, but it's very difficult to kind of get yourself into that headspace. But I've been better at doing that over the last few years, and it certainly has incredibly helped my mental health.
That's brilliant. This is a question which is, I look back at it now thinking, why did I write this? Because it's a silly question. But obviously, you've got lots of stuff in the pipeline you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, lots of things. I suppose one of the nature of kind of what I do is often stuff gets thrown at me quite quickly. So there might be something come up or a wall that comes up, and I have to kind of think about it. So as much as I'm thinking about things all the time, I actually have lots of ideas that might be kind of gestating for several months. And nothing happens with them, and then suddenly the right opportunity comes up. So yeah, at the moment I'm really thinking about next year. I have a few projects maybe to happen before the end of the year. I'm editing the video piece around the performance I did in Hugh Lane. I'm doing another film piece at the moment this weekend. So there's lots of little things, and lots of kind of seeing where I can kind of push the masks, all the different types of masks that I want to make around different moments in my life, and different moments or different not necessarily causes, but different things I want to provoke or talk about.
That's brilliant. And I think the final question has to be, where can people find you?
Well, probably the handiest place is on my Instagram. So just look up Asbestos on Instagram and you'll probably find me.
Yeah, look up. I'm obviously following. So if you are having any trouble, just go into my page and then go into Asbestos and follow. And all the stuff we've talked about is up there. It's all brilliant work. Asbestos, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sure, thank you.
Could you stick around for 1 minute? I'll just finish out. I want to get a photo. I always take a promo photo, and this one is particularly special. So, I'll close it out. Thank you very much to John for all his technical help on the podcast. As always, to my mom, my dad, granddad, Jaron Calvin for the music, for the logo. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you wouldn't mind. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. This podcast goes out on Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, a couple of other ones that I never remember. Should start writing them down maybe. But as always, thanks to everyone for tuning in. And once again, Asbestos, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will chat to everybody else next week. Take care. Bye.